Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I begin by saying that it is a real honour and a privilege to get a chance to speak in front of so many of our distinguished American colleagues. We at Atlantic Bridge have been delighted at the success of our partnership with ALEC, and we're excited about what we might achieve together in the future. In particular, we are patting ourselves on the back at having chosen such a distinguished and solid values-based organization to be our partner, because the values that you have are values which need to be embedded at every level of government, not just national or federal government. And it's worth pointing out that the last Conservative Prime Minister in the United Kingdom began his career in local government and ended up at the top of national government, a lesson sometimes we would all do very well to learn. And the leadership programme that we have been working on this week aims to propagate these values at every level of government so that politics in our respective countries becomes run once again for the public and not for the politicians. We're also here because, as you've already heard, we believe very strongly in the need to defend the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. Now, when Winston Churchill gave his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he coined the phrase the Iron Curtain, the speech is mostly remembered for that, he also talked for the first time about the special relationship. And it wasn't some gooey, dewy-eyed, Disney-esque, emotional special relationship that he talked about. Churchill was a war leader. He understood that the special relationship worked best in intelligence, in interoperability of our military, and in shared values and training. And that's what we need to get back to, understanding some of the realities of what exactly lies out there. And that special relationship reached its peak, in my view, in the Thatcher-Reagan era. In Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, we were blessed to have two of the greatest post-war leaders that we ever had at the same time when we really needed them. And I don't know about you, but I get pretty cross with liberal revisionists who seem to constantly want to rewrite our history. And perhaps we should make a couple of points to them this morning. You know, the Cold War didn't just end, the Cold War was won. The Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall didn't just fall down. It was torn down by many very angry people who had been repressed by brutal regimes for a long period of their history. And the end of the Cold War was a victory and a vindication for our values, as well as a testament to the strength, the consistency, and sheer grit of our leaders. And we will need all those qualities once again. Our values, our security, and our very way of life itself are under threat. This is, of course, nothing new. And if you live long enough, you see it all come round again. But those values, that way of life, they were threatened by fascism in the Nazi era. They were threatened by communism in the Soviet era. And today, we face another threat. A violent, anti-Western, transnational, Islamist fundamentalism again threatens our values, our heritage, our way of life. And I tell you that we cannot avoid this confrontation. I hear in the United Kingdom, I hear in Europe, I even hear in the United States that if only we weren't in Iraq, if only we weren't in Afghanistan, these fanatics would leave us alone and the level of the threat would diminish. That is palpable nonsense. We cannot avoid the confrontation because there are those who have already chosen to confront us. And they hate us not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And perhaps, just perhaps, we have the luxury of choosing whether to have that confrontation on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, or have it in Manhattan, or have it on the London Underground, and I know which I think responsible leaders will choose to do. We live in a very dangerous age. We need to have strength and consistency and realism in our approach to foreign policy. And it means that our leaders must not give us false timetables. They must not set goals for our policy which cannot be fulfilled realistically and which otherwise will mean that our electorate become disaffected and our agendas become ultimately more difficult to pursue. When we are trying to reconstruct Afghanistan, you cannot drop a Jeffersonian democracy onto a broken 13th century state and expect it to be up and running in 5 years, or even 10 years, or 20 years. That will be the long haul, and we need to set expectations appropriately. We need to get away from simplistic ideas. For example, that democracy is simply the exercise of electoral mechanics. If that were true, Gaza would be the beacon state in the Middle East. We have a long historical experience. We in the United Kingdom are a liberal democracy. I use the term liberal in the classical sense, not the pejorative sense that you tend to use it here at this meeting. We're a liberal democracy, but we were liberal long before we were democratic. There was 150 years between Adam Smith and universal suffrage in the United Kingdom. We abolished slavery 100 years before we gave women the vote. We never extended our franchise when we thought it would put at risk the social stability or economic well-being of our nation. We should perhaps sometimes remember that to make a democracy operate effectively, you need several things to happen simultaneously. You have to be able to exercise your personal economic liberty inside a market system. You have to have a rule of law that applies equally to the governed and the governing. And you have to have a concept of rights that applies to everybody, irrespective of gender, of creed, or of colour. All these things take time to develop. And in our policy, I think we require subtlety in that understanding. Otherwise, we will find resentment and disappointment. We live in a genuinely globalized age. I sometimes wonder whether politicians quite grasp globalization in its fuller concept. The business community certainly do. Politicians like the trade and prosperity side of globalization. But I wonder if they fully recognize that in a genuinely interdependent global economy, we have an unavoidable importation of strategic risk. Our well-being and our interests can be threatened in many more parts of the world and by many more players than they might have been in the past. And yet we're trying to deal with a complex, interdependent, 21st century globalized economy with political structures that were designed for the post-Second World War environment and military structures largely designed for the bipolarity of the Cold War. And now we look at the G8, which has become largely a talking shop, but at increased cost and security. At NATO, which is struggling in Afghanistan, where those on the front line doing the fighting and the dying are those from the United States, from the United Kingdom and Canada. Spot the historical pattern. And where we have institutions such as the United Nations, where we're supposed to go to countries like Zimbabwe and beg them for moral authority when we believe we have to carry out actions in our own national interests. Absolutely absurd, if not obscene.